Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Voice of Context. So we turn our focus to one of China's most dramatic AI chip story. Everyone probably knows what I'm going to talk about. Yes, it is Cambricon.
Cambricons.
And it's more than doubled since then, climbing all the way up.
Company reporting a record first half profit.
成本价更是超越了贵州茅台，一跃成为目前 A 股的最贵个股。
China will fill more of its own AI orders.
I mean, this is astonishing what's happening with Cambricon.
So in Q2 2025, just last quarter, the Cambricon reported a 44x revenue growth, which is a really huge growth, and turned profitable for the first time. So Cambricon is sudden hero. It's a survivor story, to be exact. So a little bit backstory. They went public on the STAR market in 2020, dubbed as China's first AI chip stock. Its stock plunged from 250 at the highest point to 50 RMB, of course, to below 30 RMB by 2023. Many think they may not survive. So it's really a dramatic story. So today, me and Aaron, we're gonna give you a little bit dive into the Cambricon story for the past quarter. Hello, Aaron.
Hello, Diane. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you.
So to begin with, what do you think of Cambricon? It's a really dramatic story, not from just entrepreneurial perspective, it's also from investment perspective, right?
It is. Cambricon's market cap is now around 17 billion RMB, right? But at the start of 2024, it was just 9 billion. So you can say that there was 8-fold increase in less than 2 years. But however, if you look back in time, Rome was not built in one day. Cambricon has two major turning points in its history. However, I think everyone knows about the recent one, which is in 2025, Cambricon became the #1 chip company in China, but not many remember the first turning point. I think to understand what has really changed, we need to look at both.
Yeah, maybe I'll just give a little bit background story about the founder and how the company started.
那么寒武纪呢，在这个智能芯片方面呢，是国内起步最早的这个公司之一，在世界范围呢也是。
The founder's name is Dr. Chen Tianshi. So he is a classic scientist turned entrepreneurial kind of story. So he graduated from USTC and then spent years at Chinese Academy of Science and working as a processor architect. In 2015, so his team developed this Cambricon 1A, so one of the world's first chips designed for deep learning. So by then, people barely heard about like RNN network and hear about like deep learning in 2015. But he's like really the forefather of the AI space. And then later, 1A chip was used in Huawei's Kirin 970. So at that time, AI was still in its infancy, and then he already decided to want to start a company in this space. So he left the academy in 2016. And he started Cambricon. I think by then I was in Silicon Valley investing in hardware, so the valuation was pretty high already. I don't think we got in. The fund I was working for, we didn't get in. It was really popular. And it was backed by several really prominent national capitals and then really quickly rising in prominence.
Yeah, for the record, when you mentioned AI, the AI in 2015 is a very different conception compared with 2025, right? At that time, when we talk about AI, it was AI in smartphone. But today, when we talk about AI, it was AI in almost everything.
Yeah, it was mostly in mobile, edge, IoT stuff. It's not today.
Yeah, so it's completely different AI. We didn't have ChatGPT at that time.
Right. But things really turned. They have really high R&D spending. Continued losses after they went public in 2020, and then they have a lot of skepticism towards them. And
Yes.
then I think at some point in 2023, they were almost facing they kind of going to get delisted. Is that a thing?
Yes and no, but not really. That's not the true story behind the things. So as we mentioned in the very beginning, there were two turning points in the history of Cambricon. The second turning point is 2025, which is this year. Cambricon become a very hot topic for global investors. But I think what is more important is the first turning point, which happened in 2019. And at that time, Cambricon was a very, very different company. So as Diane mentioned, its biggest customers back then was HiSilicon. And who is HiSilicon? It's actually one of Huawei's chip subsidiaries. And also it's the leader in China's chip industry at that time. So at that time, Cambricon wasn't making chips it makes today. It was completely different. Cambricon was focused on smartphone chips. and it was doing IP licensing business. The chip series you mentioned is called 1A. 1A series IP was used in Huawei smartphone processors. So if you look at the number, the single customers account for over 98% of the company's total revenue. So which we can tell that Huawei was the owning customer for Cambricon at that time, which is
Right.
it's a
Huge
good
risk.
story, but it's also a sad story because around 2019, this particular client, which is Huawei, decided to develop its own IP processors, and which later become Huawei's NPU called Ascent. Ascent is Huawei developed IP AI
Right.
processors. So what Huawei would do, it actually stopped buying IP from Cambricon. So it turned out to be a disaster. For the company to dependent on one single customer so much, its business model was
Right.
on the verge of collapse. That was the first crisis and also the first turning point. And then after that year, Cambricon made a very incredible, difficult decision. It shifted from IP business model of licensing design to a very heavy model, which is developing and selling its own AI chips for cloud and edge computing.
Which is
That's a totally
like
different area.
very similar as Nvidia did now.
Yes, you can say that. At that time, people say that Cambricon was China's Nvidia.
That was back in 2019.
Yeah, 2019,
Roughly.
2020. Yeah. There was no AI demand for cloud computing. So
Right.
the path Cambricon chose was a very difficult path, actually.
So basically, the founder, Chen Tianxi, he's like really a visionary after his sole client got dropped.
Look, there are two sides of a story. One of
Right.
my schoolmates was actually working with Chen Tianshi at that time. Two sides of story. The first one is that they are visionary. So they saw the future at that time. That's why they shift their path. And the second story is that they have no choice.
I think it's both could be right.
Yeah, both could be right. But the result is what we see today. The company
Right.
quickly shifted its R&D focus. They launched a new series of chips called Siyuan, and in English, it's MLU series. That's the new AI chips for cloud computing. This means that Cambricon was no longer selling IP. It has to handle everything from chip design, manufacturing, and production. So this path requires huge investment and carry very high risk. But it was the only way. It was the only way. And that year was 2019. 1 year right after China and the US had the first trade conflict. However, Cambricon was making huge losses in profit every single year afterwards because the R&D spending was so huge. So
Right.
that could be the end of the story, end of the first story. They have a turning point. They lose their single most important customer. But however, they have to try another way, which was a difficult path because not so huge AI demand at that time.
So they did a total pivot in 2019, and then they decided to raise more capital. That's why they decided to win IPO.
Yeah, they went to
and
public.
win.
When they went to public, one of the hedge fund, and it's a US-based hedge fund, came to me. They asked me for a report to short Cambricon's stock. You know what? It's
Why-
funny. It's funny because
Yeah.
because even though we call Cambricon was the Nvidia of China at that time, but if you look at
No
the
one
data,
believes it.
no one believes it. You look at the data, you look at the chips, and there's like a generations gap between them. So that is why they want to short the stock price.
So after they went public in 2020, I think their highest stock price was at 250, right? That was when? That was like right after they went public?
Yes, right after they went public.
So there are investors, probably mostly domestic. In China, the investors are really believe in them, and then that's why their stock price was pretty high up.
I think it's not probably, it's definitely, or domestic investors. It doesn't matter if they believe in the story or not, because Cambricon at that time was the only option that they can invest for China chips in A-share market. When we talk about A-share market and talk about the valuation, the stock price, we have to remember that A-share market is not open or it's not widely open to overseas investors. And
Right.
for domestic investors, we are not free to invest in the US or European, Japanese market. So there are very limited options. And Cambricon was the only one. The number one chip makers in China at that time was HiSilicon. As we mentioned before, it's Huawei's chip subsidiary, which was not a public company. There's no way to invest in. So Cambricon was the only option.
And basically, they're the only company that's wide a range of like chips for AI, and then they also probably promised they're going to have a similar like CUDA platform like Newware as they released earlier this year. So basically, there's the only option. But from 2020 to 2023, and there's what happened there. Like there's ups and downs, like a roller coaster, but not up and just down, right?
Yeah, mostly down, but not so many ups. However, that came the second turning point. I know everybody talk about Cambricon this year, but 2025 was not the second turning point. Actually, 3 years earlier, 2022 was the turning point. You know why? Because 2022 was the real game changers. In December 2022, the US government added Cambricon to its entity list, which means sanction. Cambricon becomes the target of US government sanction at that time.
Right.
So what is the impact? This means that the company was restricted from accessing advanced US technology, for example, chip design software. And it can no longer use the top manufacturing service like TSMC in Taiwan. So it directly threatened Cambricon's ability to design and produce the next generation chips. And this was Cambricon's second near-death experience. That's 2022. But as we mentioned earlier, after Cambricon's first turning point, it switched its focus from IP licensing to cloud computing AI chips. But it's making huge losses every year because it's not making money and there's not enough demand. However, the second turning point, the US sanctions, they block companies like Nvidia from exporting their high-end AI chips to China.
Right.
That was a game changer. Because without Nvidia, they create a very huge and protected market for high-performance AI computing powers in China. Domestic cloud companies like AI data centers and large enterprises were forced to look for local alternatives.
Right.
And you can guess what? The only alternatives was Cambricon.
But how did Cambricon solve their supply manufacturing problems? I think there's like very short window for them to fix that problem, right? It's not a small problem to fix.
It's a big problem. That is why the turning point actually happened in 2022. But we only see Cambricon turning into profit on a quarterly basis in 2024. There was a 2 years gap between them.
So that threshold is actually the birth of ChatGPT 3.5, and then their turning point is the big tech companies like Alibaba, like Tencent, like ByteDance. They start to look for suppliers. Other than they need a real supplier, not just a plan B option to facing the increasing demand for their AI products.
Yes, they need a real suppliers. They can no longer buy Nvidia chips, right? Domestically within China, it's very difficult to buy AI chips. However, there's something that Cambricon has to solve first. As we talked about before, it can no longer access to TSMC. So what is the best alternative? It was SMIC, the domestic China AI chip manufacturing companies. And that was the only option. It took 2 years for SMIC to actually work its own way out. So it's not a story about Cambricon, it's a story about SMIC. And in 2 years' time, SMIC were actually able to produce the same quality of AI chips, which is equal to Nvidia's 7 nanometers. So Cambricon has to depend on foundries like SMIC, right? Because it has no access towards advanced manufacturers in globally other parts. So now, if you look at the financial statement from SMIC, SMIC's 7 nanometers class process is just like 2 to 3 generations behind the TSMC and Samsung. But however, even though it's 2 generations behind, it has already made a huge process, which means they can produce AI chips that is usable. I mean, it's not globally competitive, but it's usable for Chinese chip manufacturers. And that is why Cambricon then can produce its newest version of MLU AI chips based on the foundry service of SMIC.
Right. This is basically a very similar story like how Nvidia getting friendship with SMIC in the first place back in like 20 years ago. Yeah.
This means that all things being equal, Chinese chips will also lag behind international competitors. But however, it works. It keeps them in the game.
So the geopolitics didn't like ban everything. It's kind of like accelerate the Chinese company. They build their own capabilities. So it's the other side of the story.
Yes. And that's also what I want to talk about, because many people are asking the question like, is that because of geopolitical or is that because of real demand, right? That's a very common question investors get to ask. You know, in my view, geopolitical is real demand. Political power is the number one driving force for technology demand. We have to see this very clear. Think about it. Over the last 100 years, hasn't technology advance been tied to the need of war? And isn't war driven by geopolitics? Think about it. And think about today's America, right? SoftBank invests billions of dollars in the US, and OpenAI invests tens of billions of dollars. Isn't that all tied to politicals? President Donald Trump, the one who is so eagerly pushing for more.
I think it's the driving force, and then everyone else is just like work together, or better words, is fall in line with the same interest.
Yes, there has to be geopolitical demand. So look at the price of Bitcoin. Right, the price of Bitcoin surged because of the political winds in the US shifted, and that's geopolitical, or that's political. So that's my conclusion. Geopolitical is the primary engines of demand nowadays, and that's real demand.
Right, but I think from the other side, if US didn't do the aggressive tech decoupling and ban all the exporting of the Nvidia chips, and China won't have this much of pressure to build their own chips and manufacture. It won't be this accelerating speed.
Absolutely. I think the US is making a huge mistake, because the best way to block China's technology advance is to sell cheap chips to China, right, and make sure that every company in China accessible towards cheap chips and cheap, right, and better function chips. But now the game has changed. So that is why we saw the second turning point in 2022. Not 2025.
It just seems obvious, like Alibaba, Tencent, and Biden's, their AI strategy just fall in line with the Capricorn's growth. Yeah. And then basically they're the only options on the market, and they're compatible, like compliance compatible, they're like technically functional, and they're ready to ship. So just everything just like happened all at once. That's why we see the 44x of growth.
Yes. If you look at the number, the capex of Alibaba, Tencent, and ByteDance, they are investing heavily in AI data centers. So the overall size, if you compare them with Magnificent Seven, the overall capex size was smaller. But if you look at growth rate, in the US, the Magnificent Seven is about growing at more than 30% on a year-on-year basis in terms of the capex spending. But if you look at the Chinese companies, they are growing at over 45% year-on-year basis in terms of the capex. So it was growing faster than the US competitors. That is why we see, the demand in China is not as huge as the US companies, but it's growing very quickly. And Nvidia is absent from this growth.
Right. So let's take a step back. Is Capricorn stock price is like too much bubbled already? Is it like overpriced? What do you think?
Well, it depends on how you
view it. If you're comparing it to Nvidia.
Right. For me, as an international investor, I would actually compare between Chinese companies, US companies, Japanese companies, and etc. But for domestic Chinese A shares investors, they have no choice but to invest in Capricorn. We know there are a lot of competitors in China to compete with Capricorn, but they are not public companies yet, so there was no way to invest in their stocks. Capricorn was the only option. And the current PE ratio, if you look at Capricorn, I think it's more than 150 times PE ratio, right? Or maybe even more than 200 times PE ratio. So that implies a very high risk premium. I think this is a point of criticism, especially when you compare to Nvidia, which is, looking forward is less than 30 times PE ratio. But I don't think that valuation itself means so much. It's whether it's 100 times or it's 200 times doesn't really matter, because as we said, investors in China, they have very few options. So if they want to invest in AI chips in China, there's only one option for them right now. So it's not about the valuation.
Right. What about I feel like this is, if you're comparing, China already is a huge market. If you're comparing to how Nvidia has that big of business in US and outside of US, Capricorn still have a really big space to grow into.
Actually, I think the space for Capricorn to grow is confined. Let's look at some numbers. If you compare Capricorn to Nvidia's AI chips, and you can see that the new generation for Capricorn is called the 590
MLU series.
Yeah, MLU series. And it's already using SMIC manufacturing. The function of AI chip is one thing. The ecosystem is another thing, right? As we both know that what makes Nvidia successful is not only its AI chips, but also the ecosystem around Nvidia. It's CUDA system.
Right.
So for Nvidia, it's not just about hardware. The story goes the same with Cambricon. Cambricon does not have a very complete, a very mature ecosystem around its chips. Even though if you look at chip by chip head-to-head comparison, some of Cambricon's AI chips are actually usable compared with Nvidia's AI chips, but the ecosystem is far behind CUDA system. But now things have changed because Cambricon is what they can do is to adapt. They can make its platform usable and collect to the needs of China domestic developer, but it only collects to the needs of China's domestic developer. It's not international developer. So that is why I think Cambricon's future, its upper limit is a limit within China domestic. It's not an international or global competitor.
I get that. But China, like the first thing I said, China already a big enough market. Or you think already they tap that kind of market? Like basically everyone can buy AI chips, already buying them, and then probably not going to be much more demand in the future. I don't really think that way because it's barely started the AI race between all the big companies.
I think you're right in that sense. If you look at Alibaba, there's a rumor says that Alibaba is buying AI chips from Cambricon, and at the same time, Alibaba is also developing and designing its own AI chips. But if you look at the latest conference for Ali Cloud in Hangzhou, they invite one guest. It's not Cambricon, it's Nvidia.
Okay.
They invite Nvidia. Okay, so that's the true story.
Right.
You know, it's not about patriotism. It's a real business story. You can argue about it. You can have conflict, but you can still do business.
But Alibaba is already a global company, so they also have like Ali Cloud outside of China, right? It's a rabbit hole we can go down in.
No.
I don't know. Just like the markets, there are always like all sort of like information or like all sort of news.
Yeah.
But I still think whatever like Google or like Apple or like Amazon, they all develop their own chip internally, but they still buy chips from Nvidia, right?
Yes, but for sure, they will never buy chips from Cambricon.
Sure. I
Security
agree
issue.
with that. Okay, so back to where we're talking about the potential growth possibility of Capricorn. So you think they're limited. So you think they're at a high point. They're not going to be like a hyperscaler.
No, it's not going to be because there's a high silicon, AI chip subsidiaries of Huawei, and you have AI producers, subsidiaries from Alibaba and also from Tencent. These are competitors. As we said, the high valuation of Cambricon is that because it's the only option right now for Asia investors. But it doesn't mean that it has no competitors within China. As time goes by, you will realize that it's not the only option. It's the only option for stock investors, but it's not the only option for business. So,
That's their next battle.
yes, that's the next battle.
So you were mentioning the Huawei Ascend, but they're mostly kind of like a Google TPU. They're for their internal use mostly. I mean, Huawei Ascend is mostly for their ecosystems usage. Maybe you disagree.
I disagree.
And Baidu Kunlun, there's more like Amazon Trainium, and they're there, but they're good at their cloud chips, but not like everything else, not like complete as Capricorn. And also there's Vision Tech.
Yeah.
So they're like targeting to also matching A100, H100 performance, but they're more like AMD. I don't know. Like, what's your view? What's your view?
I disagree. Well, that's a very old story. All those giants, when they enter a new areas, they always said that in very beginning that they are doing this for their internal use. That's always the story in China. But however, trust me, they will be used more than internally. Yeah, they will be sold to outside competitors. They will be sold to Ali. I mean, you can imagine that one day Alibaba is selling chips to Tencent, and Tencent is selling chips to Alibaba, and they are both buying chips for Capricorn, which is very likely. So in China, there's rarely huge market is dominated by one players. In China, rarely. There has to be like more than three. Look at the delivery market nowadays. I mean, it's a very mature market in China. It has like two dominant players already, but turned out to be what? They have a new entry, JD. And now you have JD, Alibaba, and Meituan doing the same old delivery stories again and again. So in China, don't imagine that Cambricon can actually dominate this space. It's not going to happen. There are going to be a lot of players.
But also, I think if for software giant, I think it's still kind of hard to cross into the hardware. If you say that Huawei Ascend gonna be a like really strong competitor, I will like totally agree. But if you said that Baidu or like Tencent, they're gonna make like a super high quality chips, I will be like, good luck.
Cambricon used to be a software company, right? Original business was doing IP licensing. It has nothing to do with manufacturing or production or chip sales. But you look at the result. It turns out to be it's not that difficult in China because they all depend on SMIC and other domestic foundry service.
I disagree. I disagree.
Yeah.
So, but the founder, he's like, his background is in like chip design. So it's still like a little bit different. But anything could happen in China. I totally agree. And then the whole ecosystem is far more complete and far more complicated than the U.S. market, than Silicon Valley. Like even in the U.S., in Silicon Valley, and Nvidia is not the only provider. There's AMD. There is a lot of competitor. Nvidia is a better run company. So
I think Nvidia and AMD for global investors, it's just Nvidia and AMD.
Yeah, so it's always come down into your business strategy, your ecosystem, your execution. All right, so we talked about like the potential growth of Cambricon. So what do you think the risk there are? Maybe the U.S. restriction of exporting will get loose. Is that a possibility?
Yes, I mean, in my view, that's very likely to happen because that's a bargain chips, right? China has real earth and the US have the Nvidia AI chips. So it's very likely both sides will relax their restrictions. And this will happen in the near future. But relax of the export restriction is not a game changer anymore. Not anymore. Because, look at this point. It's no longer a major factor. I mean, even if the US relax its restrictions, we will not go back to before. Why? Because the US policy changed so quickly. As everyone can see from this year, it's unreliable. So the only thing that is stable now is that Trump is not stable. So the driving force for domestic substitution in China is now a national strategy. And it's not going to change. So even if they relax the rules, they relax the restrictions, those AI giants or cloud computing giant in China will continue buying domestic substitutions.
Okay, sounds like Cambricon's real threat is just competitor from domestically.
Yes, you are totally right.
And then, I don't know, like maybe a foreign country to align with China and then maybe buy chips from Cambricon, and that's the potential growth right there.
Yeah. What's funny is that if you talk to management teams from Cambricon, none of them actually expect their valuation to be so high. And none of them actually had a vision that their company could be, like billions of RMB's market cap. So one thing we have to observe right now is when would the management want to sell their stocks? Because most of them, from the very beginning of their IPO until now, they haven't sold their stocks yet. They are very rich, they are wealthy in book, but they haven't got the real monies back. So let's say when they want to sell their stocks, that could be a sign that this company reached a very high stage.
I think probably themselves internally is trying to compare themselves to Nvidia also, and then they're not quite there yet internally. You think that they're going to have like a big sell-off pretty soon?
No. Actually, the sad side of the story is that even though the market cap is so high, I think they are somehow restricted from selling their shares right now. It's not about their company owning. It's an icon. So any selling of shares from the management team would be regarded as a very bad sign or negative sign on the future of the company, which means they are somehow, quoted, restricted from selling large shares.
That's a good news for the
investors.
For other investors, yes.
Okay, so if you want me to give a conclusion on the story of Cambricon, I would say that most of the companies, they become successful, they become great companies not because they choose to become, it's because they are forced to become. If we look at the history of Cambricon, the story becomes very clear that they are forced to take the first turning point, and also they are forced to take the second turning point, neither of which comes because of their vision or the strategy of the management. No, they are forced to do that. So that might be a very fun story, a fun fact of those great companies in China right now.
Right. I think it's counter a lot of people's point is that under like a Chinese government protection. I think it's not a total story. There's bunch of competitors on that market. It's not a story.
No.
And then I think they just didn't give up.
Yeah, Chinese government never tried to, block competitions.
Right. It's the U.S. side.
Yeah, that's what I said. They are forced to become great.
Well, that's pretty much about it. Thank you for listening to watching our podcast. And then if you want us to talk about any other Chinese companies, then please let us know. If you have any other suggestions, please also let us know. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.